As the penguin walks on the ice, he leaves his little footprints behind on the little snowdrift that sort of formed on top of the ice. Let's see how this was done. As you can see, when the penguin walks across the scene, his feet leave a little impression into the snowdrift there. That's just a piece of geometry, which is a metaform object. Now, it's not the feet that's actually pushing down on the metaform snowdrift to create the recessed footprints in there. Behind the scenes, what we have is some metaform spheres, and it's the spheres that are pushing down to sort of create the footprints. So let's go ahead and see how the metaforms works. Any object you create in formz can be a metaform object. In this case, we'll create a couple of metaform spheres. Now, these are just wireframe objects at this point. There's no solid or surface geometry there. We can form an implicit surface of any mesh resolution around those objects. And you can see if I were to take one of those objects and move those around, you can see that if a metaform object comes in contact with any other metaform object, they'll actually blend together to form a single object, as that implicit surface is constantly re-evaluating around those objects. Now, we can edit one of those metaform objects and not only change the size, but change the weight. So instead of a positive weight, we'll give it a negative weight. So now you can't see the negative weight object, but you can see the influence of that object when it comes in contact with other metaform objects. So now instead of blending with, it's actually repelling the other geometry from it. And that's how we create the footprints by simply having a series of metaform spheres that sort of follow along where the actual feet go. Next, let's recreate the part of the animation where the penguin is joyfully swimming underwater. So he's looking for some lunch or dinner maybe. And you can see there's a nice little trail of bubbles that follow behind. So let's see how this was done. We begin by going back to the penguin that we created earlier. There he is. And we'll create a little path for him to follow. So let's switch to the ZX plane and maybe use the spline drawing tool. Create a nice little spline curve. And as I switch the plane back to the XY plane, I can turn the visibility on and off for the grid. And I'm going to edit that. See, it's very easy to manipulate this geometry in 3D space here and give it more of a three-dimensional curve. And then what I'll do is use the tool that we just previously used. We'll actually animate the object along the path. Now that looks pretty good, except for when we play it back, you can see that the penguin looks a little stiff right now. But we need him to actually bend and deform as he goes along the path. Now we could do some deformation animation tracks, but there's a faster, easier way to do that. Here's a new tool that we haven't looked at yet. That's the Bend Along Path tool. What it allows us to do is take the object and have it bend as it goes along the path. And you can see that the curvature percentage slider, as I move it across, I can control where it's at along the path, and you can see that it automatically bends and deforms to follow the curvature of that path. Now this is just a modeling tool. We can also animate these parameters. Anything that has a red dot next to it is an animatable parameter. So what we'll do is we'll start it at the beginning of the path, move the timeline down, and at that point in time, I'm going to move it to the very end of the path. Now all I do is play it back, and you can see it starts at the beginning of the path and just over time interpolates into the very end of the path. And all of the bending is automatically done for me. Now to create the bubbles behind, what we can do is maybe create a cylinder, which if I were to render that, you can see instead of a solid cylinder, it renders as this white speckle material, which looks like bubbles. It's just a white color that has an eroded transparency. So it's just a partially transparent surface, which sort of emulates something that would look like bubbles. Now what we're going to do is take that cylinder and we're going to use the Bend Along Path tool, but we're going to use a different option here so we can actually stretch the object across the entire length of the path. So there's the bottom of the object and there's the top of the object. So I can control both the start and end of the object as it stretches along the path. So let's go ahead and animate the end of the object. We'll have it start at the beginning of the path. And as I move down the timeline, I can then change that parameter and have it stretch all the way to the very end of the path. And now when I play that back, you can see that all we're doing is taking the cylinder and actually stretching the end along that path to follow behind the penguin. And then, of course, when you actually render that, you don't see the solid cylinder. What you see is the eroded transparency to create the bubbles. Next, we shall recreate the part where the penguin slides across the ice and makes a little splash into the water. And you can see the little ice chunks are sort of floating up and down on top of the surface there. And we'll also animate the camera where it sort of pans back and drops down below the surface of the water. So here's the scene. It's relatively simple. Let's go into interactive shaded. There's the NURBS surface we created at the beginning, the NURBS by boundary curves for the ice. And there's the penguin bending along the path. And when he hits the water, of course, nothing happens. The water is just a flat surface. So we need to animate that. We need to deform the surface. And so let's look at one other deformation option. That's the circular wave. Give it the height and width of the wave and click anywhere you want on the object. Creates a circular wave disturbance on it. We can even click on an ice chunk and have a circular wave disturbance on that if we want. Now, when we position the circular wave disturbance on the object, you can see we can also animate those parameters if we want. For example, the height, you can see I can actually keep the height sort of spiked up to the maximum height value when I want to create the splash event and then have it ramp back down. I never set the height value to 0. I always set it to maybe 1/8 of an inch so that you always have some kind of rippling on the water. So it looks like a breeze blowing across the surface of the water there. Now notice that the ice chunks are not floating up and down on the water. So what we can do is just simply grab those objects, drag and drop those into the circular wave animation. And you can see that those take on the same circular wave deformation as the surface of the water. Now there's no physics involved. It's just using that same animation track and just dragging and dropping the items in there. Now to create the animated view, you can see I can just sort of navigate around, save a series of views inside of the views palette. And then what I'll do is I'll pick those views in a particular order. So I'll pick maybe view 1, view 2, and view 3. So on the side view, you can see those different views there. And once I have those views picked, I can use the Animate Entity tool, which will automatically create an animation through the pre-picked objects. Now, if these are views, then of course it'll give me a brand new view, which is an animated view that goes through those views that I have picked. So you can see that the camera is following that spline curve, which was automatically created for me. So if I make that the active view and play it back, you can see it starts off with view 1, and then it goes into view 2, and then it goes into view 3. Now there's other ways to animate cameras too. You can actually keyframe animate the camera itself, or you can draw spline curves and have the camera follow it that way if you want. But in this case, it's sort of nice that you can animate the views just by saving a few preset views. And this works also not just with views, but also with objects. So you can actually go and pre-pick a few objects, and formz will automatically animate through those pre-picked objects.